Wyoming Territory, 1872. The land was a study in stark and silent grandeur. It stretched out under a sky so vast and blue it seemed a solid thing, a bowl of sapphire inverted over the world. The wind, a constant and lonely traveler, whispered through the sparse buffalo grass, carrying the scent of dust and distant pine. It was a place that did not suffer fools or frailties, a landscape that carved men down to their essential elements: bone, will, and regret. Kate Stanton felt the silence as a familiar weight, a cloak he had pulled around himself years ago and never found reason to shrug off. From the rise, overlooking his ranch, he surveyed the world he had built. It was a kingdom of solitude. The log house, sturdy and unadorned, stood firm against the elements. The barn, its timber weathered to a soft silver gray, was a monument to hard labor. Fences, strung taut and true, marched across the rolling hills, imposing a fragile order on the wildness. His herd of Hereford cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, red and white specks against the endless green and gold of the prairie. This was his life, measured in seasons, sunrises, and the steady, solitary rhythm of his own heartbeat. He was a man carved from the same material as the land itself. At 28, his face was already etched with the lines of sun and sorrow, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, holding a caution that bordered on suspicion. He had learned the hard way that attachment was a vulnerability, a crack in the armor a man needed to survive out here. Love, he had once believed, was a hearth fire, a warmth to come home to. But he had discovered it could also be an inferno, one that consumed everything and left behind nothing but ash and the cold, hard stone of memory. So he kept to himself, his interactions with the folk in Redemption Creek limited to necessities. He bought his supplies, sold his cattle, and returned to the quiet embrace of his land. His hands, calloused and capable, rested on the worn leather of his saddle horn. He had been riding the fence line since dawn, a ritual as ingrained as breathing. Every post checked, every wire tested. It was work that required focus, that quieted the ghosts that sometimes stirred in the deepest hours of the night. The memory of a woman's laughter, light as thistledown. The phantom weight of a small child in his arms. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He had buried them, both his wife Sarah and his infant son Daniel, in the small plot behind the house, marked by simple wooden crosses. He had buried his heart with them. What remained was the rancher, the survivor. A man who understood that the only thing you could truly count on was the turning of the earth and the labor of your own two hands. A sound, thin and mournful, sliced through the vast quiet. The distant whistle of the weekly train, pulling into the station at Redemption Creek. It was a sound he usually ignored, a reminder of a world he had long since turned his back on, a world of noise and crowds and complications. But today, for some reason he could not name, the sound snagged in his mind. It felt like a premonition, a faint tremor in the bedrock of his carefully constructed solitude. He shook his head, dismissing the notion as foolishness. It was just a train. It brought mail and supplies, and the occasional foolhardy soul looking to stake a claim on a dream that would likely break them. It had nothing to do with him. He turned his horse, spurring it gently back toward the ranch house, determined to put the sound and the unsettling feeling it had stirred behind him. The steam engine hissed to a stop, its great iron wheels groaning in protest as it surrendered its momentum to the small, dusty platform of Redemption Creek. Alara Vance stood by her seat, her hands clenched around the handle of her worn valise, and took a steadying breath. The air that filtered through the open window was different from the cold, dusted air of Philadelphia. It smelled of earth and sun and something wild and untamed. For a moment, her resolve wavered. This was it, the end of a journey that had carried her 2,000 miles from everything she had ever known, and the beginning of a life she could scarcely imagine. She stepped down from the carriage, her boots sinking slightly into the thick dust of the platform. The town was little more than a single wide street flanked by raw timber buildings with false fronts that seemed to be trying and failing to pretend they were something grander. The sun was a brilliant, unforgiving eye in the sky, and the silence that settled after the train's departure was profound, broken only by the lazy buzzing of a fly and the distant clang of a blacksmith hammer. She was a stark contrast to her surroundings. Her traveling dress, a deep forest green, was of good quality but rumpled and stained with the grime of the long journey. Her honey-blonde hair was pinned in a neat chignon, but stray tendrils had escaped to frame a face that was pale with exhaustion, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She held her chin high, a small act of defiance against the overwhelming sense of being utterly and completely alone. She scanned the small crowd on the platform. A few dusty cowboys collecting parcels, a stern-looking woman herding 3 rambunctious children, the station master with his clipboard. But there was no sign of the man she had come all this way to meet. Mr. Jacob Thorne. His letters had been kind, if brief. He had described his small but promising farm, his desire for a companion to share the burdens and blessings of frontier life. He had sounded respectable, honest, a safe harbor for a woman left adrift by the influenza that had claimed both her parents and her future in the East. Kate had finished his business at the general store, loading sacks of flour and coffee onto his pack mule. He was about to mount his horse when he saw her. She stood on the platform, a solitary, elegant figure in a sea of homespun and denim. He took in the fine cut of her dress, the delicate line of her jaw, the way she clutched her bag as if it were a shield. An Easterner, a delicate thing, likely unprepared for the harsh realities of this life. He had seen them come and go, women with dreams of adventure who wilted under the relentless sun and the crushing loneliness. He felt a familiar, weary cynicism settle over him. This place was no fairy tale. It was a grinder, and it chewed up the soft and the unprepared. He watched as she approached the station master, her posture straight and proud. He could not hear her words, but he saw the man's expression shift from professional courtesy to pity. He saw the station master shake his head slowly. He saw the woman's shoulders slump, just for a second, before she straightened them again, a visible effort of will. Kate's first instinct was to turn away, to ride out of town and leave her to her fate. It was not his concern. He had his own ghosts to wrestle. He had no room for the troubles of a stranger. But he did not turn away. He remained where he was, a silent observer, as she turned from the station master, her face a mask of careful composure. He saw the moment the mask cracked. Her foot caught on an uneven plank, and she stumbled, her valise flying from her grasp and landing in the dust with a soft thud. It was that small moment of human clumsiness, of vulnerability, that broke through his reserve. Before he had consciously decided to move, he was striding toward her. Alara gasped as she regained her footing, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She bent to retrieve her bag, but another hand, large and sun-browned, reached it first. She looked up, her gaze meeting a pair of startlingly gray eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, wary and guarded. But for a fleeting instant, she saw something else in their depths, a flicker of shared sorrow, a recognition of loss. "Ma'am," Cade said, his voice a low rumble. He straightened, holding her valise. For a moment, they simply stood there, inches apart. The air crackled with an unspoken tension. He was acutely aware of the scent of lavender that clung to her, a delicate fragrance completely alien to his world of leather and pine. She was aware of his sheer physical presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. "Thank you, Mr." she began, her voice a little shaky. "Stanton, Cade Stanton." He handed her the bag, their fingers brushing. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through both of them. It was an unexpected spark of warmth in the cold reality of her situation. "I was looking for Mr. Jacob Thorne," she said, the words coming out in a rush, as if saying them aloud might somehow change the truth. "The station master informed me. He said there was an accident." Cade's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I heard about that. A week ago." His horse spooked. It was quick. He chose the word carefully, offering a small, inadequate comfort. He saw the last vestiges of hope drain from her face, leaving behind a stark, terrifying emptiness. She was stranded, penniless for all he knew, and utterly alone in a strange and unforgiving land. The cynical part of him, the part that had kept him safe for so long, screamed at him to walk away. But another part, a part he thought had died with his family, refused to listen. Sheriff Brody, a man whose comfortable girth and gentle eyes belied a spine of steel, ambled over, his badge catching the afternoon sun. "Miss Vance? I am Sheriff Brody. The station master told me about your situation. I'm truly sorry about Jacob." He glanced at Cade, his expression knowing. He was one of the few who knew the full story of Cade's loss. "Cade, good to see you in town, Sheriff," Cade acknowledged with a curt nod. "Miss Vance has nowhere to go," Brody said, his gaze shifting back to Alara. "The boarding house is full up with surveyors for the new rail spur. It's a difficult situation." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. It was not a question, but a gentle, unspoken suggestion directed entirely at Cade. Cade's jaw tightened. He knew what Brody was doing. He was being maneuvered, and he resented it. He had built his world to keep people out, and now the world was trying to force its way in the form of a woman with lost eyes and the scent of lavender. "I have a ranch," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "It's quiet. My housekeeper, Martha, is there." He was not offering. He was merely stating facts. But Brody and Alara both heard the offer. "Oh, I couldn't possibly impose," Alara said quickly, her pride warring with the rising tide of panic. She had no money for a hotel, even if one were available. She had spent nearly everything she had on the train ticket. "It's not an imposition," Sheriff Brody said smoothly, clapping Cade on the shoulder. "Cade's got more room than one man knows what to do with. And Martha will be glad of the company. It'll just be for a few days until we can figure something out for you." Best solution all around. Cade found himself trapped. Trapped by the expectant look in the sheriff's eyes, by the desperate hope that flickered in the woman's, and by that long-dormant piece of his own conscience. He let out a slow breath, the sound one of pure resignation. "My wagon's at the livery. I can take you." It was not a question. It was a surrender. The ride to the ranch was conducted in a strained silence. Alara sat stiffly on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the vast, intimidating landscape. The rolling hills seemed to go on forever, empty of the familiar comfort of buildings and crowds. The silence was a living thing, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft snort of the horses. She stole glances at the man beside her. His profile was stark against the horizon, his hands sure and steady on the reins. He had not spoken a word since they left town, his silence a wall she did not know how to breach. She felt like a piece of misplaced luggage, a problem he had been saddled with against his will. For Cade, the silence was a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts. Her presence beside him was a disruption of an order he had fought for years to maintain. She was too close. The faint scent of her perfume warred with the familiar smells of dust and leather. He could feel the warmth of her, even though they were not touching. It was a reminder of a life he had forsaken, a life of shared moments and quiet companionship. He resented the intrusion, yet he could not deny the pull of it. He felt a protective instinct stirring, an impulse he had ruthlessly suppressed for years, and it terrified him. He had learned that to protect was to care, and to care was to open himself up to the possibility of pain. When they finally crested the last rise and the ranch came into view, nestled in a shallow valley by a meandering creek, Alara let out a small, involuntary gasp. It was beautiful in a rugged, lonely way. The house looked solid and safe, a small bastion of civilization against the encroaching wilderness. A curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a welcoming plume against the deepening blue of the sky. Martha was waiting on the porch as they pulled up. She was a woman in her late 50s, her face a roadmap of kindness and hard work, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wiped her hands on her apron, her sharp eyes taking in the scene before her. Cade, looking more grim than usual, and the pale, exhausted young woman on the seat beside him. "Cade," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes questioning. "Martha, this is Miss Vance," Cade said, climbing down from the wagon. "She'll be staying for a few days. Her arrangements in town fell through." He offered no further explanation as he helped Alara down, his touch on her elbow firm and impersonal. Martha's expression softened as she looked at Alara. She saw the weariness in the young woman's eyes, the faint tremor in her hands. She had seen that look before. "Well, come in, child, coming out of the wind. You look like you could use a hot meal and a soft bed." She ushered Alara inside, her warmth a stark contrast to Cade's cold reserve. The interior of the house was simple, masculine, and impeccably clean. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, the furniture sturdy and handmade. There were no feminine touches, no curtains on the windows, no flowers in a vase. It was a house, not a home. It was a place of function, not of comfort. Martha led her to a small guest room at the back. The bed was covered with a simple quilt, the air cool and still. "You rest now," Martha said gently. "Supper will be ready in an hour." Left alone, Alara sank onto the edge of the bed, the fight finally going out of her. The composure she had maintained all day crumbled, and silent tears traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. She had traveled across a continent, chasing a fragile hope, only to find herself a charity case in the house of a silent, brooding stranger. She opened her valise and took out her most precious possession, a small, leather-bound book. Inside were letters from her mother, written in the final weeks of her illness. She opened it to the last letter, her fingers tracing the elegant, fading script. "My dearest Alara," it began, "when you read this, I will be gone, but my love for you will remain. Do not be afraid of the life ahead. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to move forward in spite of it. Build your home not with timber and nails, but with kindness, resilience, and an open heart." The words were a balm to her frayed spirit. She closed her eyes, clutching the book to her chest. She would not break. She would be resilient. She would find a way. Dinner was another quiet affair. The three of them sat at the long wooden table, the only sounds the clinking of forks against plates. Cade ate with a single-minded focus, his gaze directed at his food. Alara, feeling his discomfort as a palpable presence, picked at the hearty beef stew Martha had prepared. It was Martha who finally broke the silence. "Philadelphia is a long way from here, Miss Vance," she said, her voice kind. "Please call me Alara," she replied, grateful for the opening. "Yes, it is. Everything is bigger here. The sky, the land. It's a little overwhelming. You get used to it," Martha said. "It gets in your blood after a while. This land has a way of holding on to you." Alara glanced at Cade, who remained silent, his expression unreadable. She decided to be bold. "Mr. Stanton, your ranch is beautiful. You must have worked very hard to build it." He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she thought he would not answer. "My father started it," he said finally, his voice low. "I've continued it." The words were clipped, discouraging further conversation. He was a fortress, and his walls were high. Later that evening, as Alara sat by the fire, pretending to read a book while her mind raced, Cade came in from his final check of the barn. He stopped in the doorway, watching her. The firelight softened the lines of her face, turning her hair to spun gold. She looked fragile, out of place, and yet there was a strength in the set of her jaw that he was beginning to recognize. He saw the leather-bound book in her lap. "What are you reading?" he asked, the question surprising him as much as it did her. She looked up, startled. "Oh, it's not a novel. It's letters. From my mother." An awkward silence fell between them. He knew he should leave, go to his room, restore the distance between them. Instead, he walked over to the fireplace, resting one arm on the mantel. "She passed recently?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Alara nodded, her throat tight. "My father is well. The influenza last winter. It's why I came west. There is nothing left for me there." She had not intended to share so much, but his unexpected gentleness had unlocked something within her. It was the first time she had spoken of her loss to a stranger, and the confession left her feeling raw and exposed. Cade stared into the flames, his own ghost swirling in the dancing light. He understood, more than she could possibly know, what it meant to have your world swept away, to be left standing alone in the wreckage. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words were not a platitude. They were a simple, stark statement of shared experience. He saw the small wooden crosses on the hill behind the house in his mind's eye. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, a hollow space that never truly filled. "She told me to be courageous," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper, as if she were speaking more to herself than to him. She opened the book, her fingers finding the familiar page. She wrote, "Build your home not with timber and nails, but with kindness, resilience, and an open heart." The words struck Cade with the force of a physical blow. An open heart. He had nailed his shut years ago, believing it was the only way to prevent it from being broken again. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a fragile Easterner, but a woman of profound strength, a woman who had faced unimaginable loss and was still willing to believe in the power of an open heart. He saw the resilience her mother had written of. He saw a flicker of the kindness. And in that moment, the first stone in the wall around his own heart began to loosen. He saw a reflection of his own pain in her eyes, and for the first time in years, he did not feel entirely alone in his grief. He said nothing more, simply gave her a curt nod and left the room, but the quiet understanding that had passed between them was more powerful than any words. It was the first fragile thread of a bond, spun in a shared moment of vulnerability by the warmth of a fire. The next few days fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Alara, determined not to be a burden, insisted on helping Martha with the household chores. She learned to knead bread, her hands, accustomed to needlepoint and piano keys, growing strong and dusted with flour. She helped in the garden, feeling a simple, profound satisfaction in pulling weeds and tending to the stubborn little plants that fought for life in the hard soil. She was a quick learner, observant and uncomplaining. Cade watched her from a distance. He would see her hanging laundry, the white sheets snapping in the wind, a bright spot of color and life against the muted tones of his ranch. He would hear her quiet laughter as she talked with Martha in the kitchen. The house, which had been silent for so long, was now filled with new sounds, new scents. It was unsettling. It was pleasant. The thought was a disloyal one, and he pushed it away. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he was merely waiting for Sheriff Brody to find a suitable position for her in town. He began to see that his initial assessment of her had been wrong. She was not fragile. There was a core of steel beneath her refined exterior. One afternoon, a young calf got itself tangled in a patch of thorny brush near the creek. Cade was about to ride out to free it when he saw Alara, who had been gathering herbs for Martha, already there. She was speaking to the frightened animal in a low, soothing voice, her movements slow and deliberate as she carefully worked to untangle its leg. By the time he reached her, she had freed the calf, which scampered back to its mother. She had a long scratch on her arm, beating with blood, but she was smiling. "He was more scared than hurt," she said, looking up at him as he dismounted. He took a clean handkerchief from his pocket and wordlessly began to clean the scratch. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "You should be more careful," he grumbled, his voice gruff to cover the unexpected surge of admiration he felt. "It seems everything in this land has thorns," she replied, her gaze steady on his. "But there are flowers, too, if you look for them." Her observation hung in the air between them. He finished tending to her arm and straightened up, the distance snapping back into place. But the moment had changed something. He had seen her courage and her compassion. She, in turn, had seen the kindness beneath his harsh exterior. A quiet respect was growing between them, a fragile plant taking root in the hard soil of their shared solitude. The first sign of real trouble came a week after Alara's arrival. Cade rode into Redemption Creek for supplies and found two unfamiliar men loitering outside the saloon. They were hard-faced and wore their guns tied low in a way that spoke of profession, not precaution. They watched him with an unnerving intensity as he tied his horse to the hitching post. Inside the general store, the proprietor, Mr. Abernathy, leaned over the counter. "Be careful, Cade," he murmured, his voice low. "Those two have been asking questions. About you. And about the new lady staying at your place." Cade's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "Just sniffing around. Asking who she is, where she came from." Said they worked for Silas Croft. The name landed like a stone in Cade's gut. Silas Croft was the wealthiest man in the county, a cattle baron with an insatiable appetite for land and power. His vast ranch bordered Cade's to the north. For years, Croft had been trying to buy Cade's property, not for the grazing land, but for the one thing more valuable than gold in this territory: water. Cade's ranch was blessed with a deep, year-round current of Willow Creek, a waterway that remained steady even in the driest of summers. Croft's own land was arid, his access to water unreliable. He wanted Cade's Creek, and he was not a man who took no for an answer. Cade finished his business, his mind racing. Croft must have seen Alara's presence as some kind of new development, a potential weakness. A woman could be frightened, leveraged. The thought of Alara being used as a pawn in Croft's greedy game filled him with a cold, protective fury. He left the store, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of his Colt. The two men were still there. One of them, a burly man with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, stepped into his path. "Stanton," the man grunted. "Heard you got yourself some company. My business is my own," Cade said, his voice flat and dangerous. The man smirked. "Mr. Croft, he just likes to know who his neighbors are, especially when they're pretty little things fresh off the train. He worries they might not be suited to this country, might need a stronger hand to guide them." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. Cade's gray eyes turned to chips of ice. "You tell Silas Croft that if he or any of his men come anywhere near my land or my guest, he'll find out just how strong my hand is. Now get out of my way." He did not raise his voice, but the quiet menace in it was more potent than any shout. The man hesitated for a moment. Then, seeing the absolute conviction in Cade's eyes, he stepped aside. Cade rode home with a storm gathering inside him. The peace of his solitude had been shattered, not just by Alara's arrival, but by the threat she had inadvertently drawn to his door. He had wanted to keep the world at bay, and now the world, in the form of Silas Croft, was threatening to break it down. A few days later, the threat escalated. Cade was riding the northern fence line, the one that bordered Croft's property, when he found what he had been half expecting. A long section of his fence had been cut, the wires snipped clean. A few dozen head of his cattle had been driven through the gap, scattered onto Croft's land. It was an old trick, a way to provoke a confrontation, to create a dispute over ownership that could be settled with lawyers or, more likely, with guns. He spent the rest of the day patiently rounding up his stray cattle, his anger a slow burn in his chest. When he returned to the ranch house late that afternoon, tired and grim, he found Alara on the porch, a book in her lap, a worried frown on her face. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "You were gone a long time." The simple, genuine concern in her voice chipped away at his resolve to keep her out of it. He wanted to protect her by keeping her ignorant, but he knew that was no longer an option. She was involved, whether he liked it or not. He sat down on the porch steps, weariness settling deep into his bones. "Croft's men cut my fence, scattered some of my herd. The man the sheriff told me about? The one who wants your land." He nodded. "He wants my water. He's been trying to push me out for years. And now, because I am here, he is pushing harder," she said, her voice quiet. It was not a question. She had understood the new, dangerous dynamic immediately. "I have brought this trouble to you, Cade." He looked at her, at the guilt and fear in her eyes. The desire to reassure her, to take that burden from her, was overwhelming. "No," he said, his voice firm. "This trouble was already here. Croft is just using you as an excuse. This fight is with me, not you." But even as he said the words, he knew they were not entirely true. Her presence had changed the stakes. He was no longer just fighting for his land. He was fighting for her safety. The realization was a terrifying, exhilarating weight in his chest. The next day, the confrontation became terrifyingly direct. Martha had sent Alara into town for some thread, a simple errand on a bright, clear morning. Kate had been against it, but Alara had insisted, refusing to be a prisoner on the ranch. She was walking back to the wagon from the general store when Croft's two men materialized from the alleyway beside the blacksmith shop, blocking her path. "Well, look what we have here," the scarred man sneered, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. The little lady from Stanton Place. All alone, Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she lifted her chin, refusing to show her fear. "Excuse me, gentlemen. I need to pass, not so fast," the other man said, stepping closer. "Mr. Croft would like to extend an invitation. He thinks you might be happier at his ranch. A much more civilized place for a lady like yourself. Stanton's Place is no place for a woman. I am perfectly content where I am," Alara said, her voice cold and steady. "Now, please move aside." The scar man reached out and grabbed her arm. "I don't think you heard him right. That wasn't a request." A wave of panic washed over her, but before she could scream, a voice, cold as a winter wind, cut through the air. "Take your hand off her." Cade stood at the end of the alley, not 10 feet away. He had been on his way to the sheriff's office when he saw them corner her. He hadn't drawn his gun. He didn't need to. The barely controlled violence in his stance was more threatening than any weapon. The man holding Alara's arm laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Or what, Stanton? You gonna take on both of us?" Cade didn't answer with words. He moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, his right hand grabbing the man's wrist, his left delivering a brutal, precise blow to the man's jaw. The crack of bone on bone echoed in the narrow alley. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The second man, his eyes wide with shock, fumbled for his gun, but he was too slow. Cade was already on him, disarming him with ruthless efficiency and shoving him hard against the brick wall. "I gave you a warning," Cade snarled, his face inches from the terrified man's. "This is the last one you'll get. Tell Croft to stay away from her. Stay away from my ranch, or I will burn his world to the ground." He released the man, who scrambled to his feet, helped his unconscious partner up, and half dragged him away, disappearing down the street. The alley fell silent. Adrenaline coursed through Cade's veins. He turned to Alara. She was pale, her eyes huge in her face, but she was not crying. She was looking at him with an expression he could not quite decipher, a mixture of fear, gratitude, and something else, something deeper. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice still rough. She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "Yes, thank you." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently touched her arm, where the other man had grabbed her. "He didn't hurt you." "No," she whispered. He had to get her away from here, away from the prying eyes of the town. He took her arm, his grip firm but gentle, and led her to his wagon. He had rescued her, and in that simple, violent act, something had irrevocably shifted between them. He was no longer just her reluctant host. He was her protector, and that role, which he had fought so hard to avoid, now felt as natural and necessary as breathing. The walls he had built around his heart were not just crumbling. They were being actively torn down, and he was powerless to stop it. The ride back to the ranch was thick with unspoken emotions. Alara was shaken, but beneath the fear, a new feeling was taking root, a profound sense of safety in Cade's presence. She had seen the raw, protective ferocity he was capable of, and it was directed entirely at her well-being. The knowledge was both terrifying and deeply comforting. He was a dangerous man, but his danger was a shield for her. Cade's mind was a battlefield. The rage he had felt in that alley still simmered beneath the surface. It was a rage born of fear, the fear of what could have happened to her. He had not felt such a powerful, protective urge since Sarah. The thought sent a pang of guilt and confusion through him. He was not supposed to feel this way again. He had promised himself he would not. But his promise was proving to be a fragile thing against the reality of the woman sitting beside him. That night, A storm rolled in from the mountains, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that lashed against the small ranch house. The world outside was a churning chaos of darkness and noise. Inside, the fire in the hearth crackled, a small, defiant beacon of warmth and light. Martha had retired to her room early, leaving Cade and Alara alone in the main room. The storm seemed to have broken the dam of their reserve. The shared danger had forged a new level of intimacy between them. Alara sat on the hearth rug, staring into the flames, while Cade stood by the window, watching the lightning split the sky. "He won't stop, will he?" she said softly, breaking the long silence. "This Mr. Croft." Cade turned from the window, his face shadowed. "No, he won't." He walked over and sat in the armchair near the fire, the chair that had been empty for so long. "He sees this land, this water, and he thinks it should be his. He thinks because I am one man, I am weak, he is wrong," Alara stated, her conviction absolute. "You are the strongest man I have ever met." Her words, simple and sincere, disarmed him. He looked at her, at the firelight catching the gold in her hair, at the earnestness in her blue eyes. He felt a powerful urge to tell her everything, to unburden the secrets that had weighed him down for years. "My strength, it failed me once," he said, his voice so low she had to lean forward to hear him. The one time it mattered most, she waited, her silence an invitation. She knew this was a threshold, a door to the locked room of his past, and he was considering opening it for her. He took a deep breath, the sound ragged. "I wasn't always alone here. I had a wife. Sarah." He said her name, and the sound of it in the quiet room was like the tolling of a distant bell. "We had a son, Daniel. He was just a baby." He paused, his gaze lost in the fire, seeing not flames but memories. "There was a fever that swept through the valley 3 winters ago. It was fast, brutal. Sarah got it first. I did everything I could. I rode for the doctor in Cheyenne, a 2-day ride in a blizzard. By the time I got back, it was too late. The fever had taken Daniel, too." The confession was stark, stripped of emotion, yet the pain behind the words was a palpable thing. Alara felt her own heart ache in sympathy. She could see it all, the desperate ride, the crushing return, the unbearable silence of the house. Martha was here with them, he continued, his voice rough with unshed tears. "But there was nothing anyone could do. I built this ranch for them, a future, a legacy, and in 3 days, it all turned to dust. I thought if I had just been stronger, faster, if I had been here." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought that had clearly haunted him for years. Alara moved from the rug and knelt beside his chair. She reached out and placed her hand on his, a simple, compassionate touch. His hand was tense, but he did not pull away. "That was not a failure of strength, Cade," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "That was a tragedy. Some things are beyond our control, no matter how strong we are. You cannot blame yourself for a storm you did not create." She was echoing the wisdom her own mother had taught her, the lesson she herself had had to learn in the face of her own grief. He looked down at her hand on his, then up into her eyes. He saw no pity there, only a deep, profound understanding. He had carried his grief alone for so long, a secret, shameful burden. In sharing it with her, he felt the weight of it lessen, just a fraction. He had shown her the deepest, most painful part of himself, and she had not recoiled. She had met his pain with compassion. He turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers, his grip tight. It was a silent acknowledgement, a thank you, an admission of a need he had denied for years. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the wildness of the night, 2 lonely souls found a quiet harbor in each other's shared sorrow. The last of the stones in his wall had crumbled to dust. The next major attack came 2 nights later. Croft, angered by the public humiliation of his men and growing more desperate for the water as the summer wore on, decided on a more direct approach. Under the cover of a moonless night, he and 3 of his hired guns rode toward Cade's ranch. Their plan was simple and brutal: stampede the herd and use the confusion to set fire to the barn. Cade was restless. The intimacy he had shared with Alara had left him feeling raw, vulnerable. He was standing on the porch, staring out into the impenetrable darkness, when a faint, unnatural sound reached him. The low, nervous nickering of horses where no horses should be. His senses, honed by years of solitude and caution, went on high alert. He moved back inside, his movements silent and swift. "Elara," he said, his voice a low command. "Get the rifle from my room. Go to the back window and stay down." She saw the look on his face and did not question him. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she moved with a purpose she did not know she possessed. As she retrieved the heavy Winchester, she heard the first telltale sounds of the attack. The crack of a whip, followed by the terrified bellows of cattle. Then a gunshot. Cade was already at the front door, his own rifle in his hands. He peered through a crack in the doorframe. He could see dark shapes moving near the corral, the beginnings of a full-blown stampede. Another shape was moving toward the barn, carrying a lit torch. He knew he was outnumbered. He could not defend the house and the barn at the same time. He had to make a choice, and there was no choice. The house held Elara. The rest was just wood and animals. He fired a shot toward the man with the torch, not to kill, but to warn. The man yelped and dropped the torch, which sputtered out in the damp grass. The night erupted into chaos. Gunshots flashed in the darkness. The panicked cattle, their eyes wild with terror, thundered past the house, their hooves shaking the very ground. Cade fired again, taking cover behind the thick log wall of the porch. He heard a bullet thud into the wood near his head, sending splinters flying. Inside, Elara knelt by the back window, the heavy rifle clutched in her hands. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She felt a terrifying sense of helplessness. Cade was out there alone, fighting to protect her, to protect their home. The thought galvanized her. She would not be a damsel in distress, cowering while he fought her battles. She remembered her mother's words, resilience, courage. She saw one of the attackers trying to circle around the house to get a clear shot at Cade from the side. He was using the water trough as cover, moving stealthily through the darkness. Cade was pinned down at the front, unable to see him. Without thinking, Elara lifted the rifle, propped the barrel on the windowsill, took a deep breath, and fired. The kick of the rifle bruised her shoulder, and the noise was deafening in the enclosed space. She had no idea if she had hit him, but her shot had served its purpose. The man yelled in surprise and dove for better cover, abandoning his attempt to flank Cade. The shot had also revealed his position. Cade, seeing the muzzle flash from the back of the house, understood instantly what had happened. He pivoted and fired 2 quick shots toward the water trough. A pained cry echoed in the night, and then silence from that direction. One down, but there were still others. The fight raged on for what felt like an eternity. Cade moved with a deadly grace, using the shadows and the structures of his own ranch as both shield and weapon. But Croft and his men were determined. They laid down a withering field of fire, trying to keep him pinned. Suddenly, the back door burst open. Elara screamed as one of Croft's men, a hulking figure she didn't recognize, filled the doorway. He must have circled around during the confusion. He lunged for her, a cruel grin on his face. She was out of time to reload, to think. She acted on pure instinct. The heavy iron poker lay on the hearth. She grabbed it, swinging it with all her might. The poker connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening crunch. He staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief, before collapsing in a heap on the floor. At that exact moment, Cade, hearing her scream, had risked everything to rush back inside. He saw the man fall and Elara standing over him, the poker in her hand, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. There was no time to react. Another figure appeared in the doorway behind Cade. It was Silas Croft himself, his face contorted with rage, his pistol leveled at Cade's back. "Stanton," he roared. Cade spun around, but he was too late. He was off balance, his rifle not in position. He braced for the impact of the bullet, but it never came. Elara, seeing the danger, let out a cry and threw herself at Cade, pushing him to the floor. Croft's shot went wide, splintering the doorframe. The momentary distraction was all Cade needed. From a floor, he fired his rifle. The The shot was true. Croft cried out, clutching his shoulder, and stumbled back out into the night. The remaining gunman, seeing his boss wounded and their numbers dwindling, lost his nerve. He fired one last wild shot before melting away into the darkness, dragging Croft with him. And then there was silence. A deafening, ringing silence, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the distant, fading thunder of the stampeded herd. The immediate danger was over. Cade pushed himself to his feet, his body aching, his ears ringing. He turned to Alara, who was still on the floor, pushing herself up. Her face was smudged with soot, a scratch on her cheek, but she was alive. She was safe. The events of the past week, the fear, the growing affection, the terror of the fight, it all coalesced into a single, overwhelming realization. He had almost lost her. He had almost sent her away. The thought was a physical pain, sharper than any bullet. His carefully constructed world of solitude, his belief that attachment was a weakness, had been burned away in the fire of the gunfight. It was not a fortress. It had been a prison. And she, with her quiet strength and open heart, had handed him the key. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her to her feet, his hands gentle on her arms. He looked at her, truly seeing her, not as an intrusion or a complication, but as the center of his world. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer suppress. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that was both fierce and tender. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, reassuring himself that she was real, that she was here. "I was going to send you away," he whispered against her hair, the confession tasting like ash in his mouth. I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. To keep myself from feeling this." She pulled back slightly, just enough to look up at his face. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of relief and exhaustion and a dawning, wondrous joy. "Feeling what, Cade?" He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. His gray eyes, no longer stormy or guarded, were clear and filled with a raw, breathtaking vulnerability. "I love you," he said, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. "When I thought of you leaving, when I saw Croft gun on you, I realized that a life without you isn't a safe one. It's an empty one. It's no life at all. I was wrong. Solitude isn't strength. It's just loneliness. My home wasn't a home until you walked into it." Tears streamed down Alara's face, but she was smiling. She had dreamed of hearing those words, but had never truly believed she would. She raised a hand to his cheek, her touch gentle. "Oh, Cade, I love you too. I think I have from the moment you picked up my valise, and I saw the sadness in your eyes." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of tentative exploration, but one of absolute certainty, of homecoming. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, a desperate, passionate claiming in the aftermath of violence and fear. In the wreckage of the attack, surrounded by the evidence of the battle for their lives, they had found their victory, not in the defeat of their enemies, but in the surrender to each other. The dawn that followed the attack was quiet and serene, a gentle apology for the violence of the night. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange. Cade had spent the early hours rounding up what was left of his scattered herd, his mind still reeling from the events and his own confession. Alara, after tending to her own bruises and the unconscious thug they had tied up in the cellar, had set about making the house feel like a home again, cleaning up the debris, her heart singing with a joy so pure it felt like a dream. Sheriff Brody and a posse arrived mid-morning, having been alerted by a neighboring rancher who had heard the gunshots. They took the captured man into custody and listened grimly as Cade recounted the night's events. "We'll get him, Cade," Brody promised, his face set in hard lines. "This time Croft has gone too far. Attempted murder on top of everything else. He won't slip away from this." The posse rode out, grim-faced and determined, on the trail of Silas Croft. When they were gone, an exhausted peace settled over the ranch. Cade and Alara stood on the porch, surveying the damage. A few bullet holes in the walls, a splintered doorframe. Scars. But the house stood strong. It stood strong. Cade turned to her, his expression serious. "Alara, what I said last night, I meant every word. I don't want you to ever leave this place. I want you to stay. As my wife." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. He opened it. Nestled on a bed of faded velvet was a simple gold ring, a small, sparkling diamond set in its center. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice husky. "She and my grandfather built the first cabin on this land. She said this ring wasn't about wealth, but about a promise to build something that lasts, together. I know I have no right to ask. After everything I've put you through." Alara silenced him by placing her fingers on his lips. Her eyes were shining with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Kate Stanton, you have every right. And my answer is yes. 1,000 times, yes." He slid the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly. He pulled her in his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around, a laugh bubbling up from his chest. A real, unburdened laugh, a sound she had never heard before. It was the sound of a man who had finally come home. News traveled fast in the territory. Croft and his remaining man were captured 2 days later, hiding out in a lined shack in the mountains. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Croft's reign of terror was over. The community of Redemption Creek, which had once looked upon Alara with a mixture of pity and suspicion, now saw her for what she was, a woman of incredible courage and fortitude. The story of her standing up to Croft's men, of her fighting alongside Cade to defend the ranch, became the stuff of local legend. When they rode into town to be married by the circuit judge a month later, they were not just two individuals. They were a symbol of resilience. The townspeople, who had once been Cade's distant acquaintances, now greeted him with warmth and respect. They helped with the repairs to his ranch, bringing lumber and food and offering their labor. They had rallied around Cade and Alara, their unions serving as a catalyst that transformed a collection of isolated homesteaders into a true community. Their wedding was a simple ceremony in the judge's office, but half the town was there to witness it, showering them with well wishes and celebrating their new beginning. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, painting the land in hues of gold and amber. The Wyoming wilderness was as vast and untamed as ever, but for the Stanton family, it was no longer a place of solitude, but of sanctuary. The ranch house had grown. A new wing had been added, and the porch now wrapped around the entire front of the house. Blue morning glories, planted by Alara, climbed the porch railings, their vibrant color a testament to the life that now flourished here. The scars on the house from that violent night had been repaired, the wood new and bright, a reminder not of the battle, but of the victory. Alara sat in a rocking chair on the porch, a sleeping baby nestled in her arms. He was a beautiful boy, with his mother's fair hair and his father's serious gray eyes. They had named him Daniel, not to replace the child Cade had lost, but to honor his memory, to signify that life and love could bloom again even from the deepest sorrow. She was humming a soft lullaby, her heart full to bursting with a happiness so profound it felt tangible, something she could reach out and touch. She saw Cade walking up from the barn, his stride long and easy. The years had been kind to him. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened, replaced by the crinkles of frequent smiles. The guarded, wary look was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence and a deep, abiding peace. He was still a man of few words, but his silence was no longer a wall. It was a comfortable, shared space between them. He was no longer the wounded loner. He was a husband, a father, a man rooted in love and community. He came up the steps, his boots making a soft, familiar sound on the wooden planks. He leaned down and kissed her, his lips gentle, then placed a tender kiss on the baby's forehead. "He's sleeping soundly," Cade said, his voice a low, contented rumble. "He had a busy afternoon helping his father check the fences," Alara replied, her smile teasing. She had ridden out with them, the baby strapped securely to Cade's chest, her own horse keeping pace. She was as comfortable in the saddle now as she had once been in a Philadelphia parlor. She had not just adapted to this life. She had embraced it had become a part of it, as strong and resilient as the land itself. Cade sat on the railing in front of her, his large frame blocking the setting sun. He reached out, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on their son. "I was thinking today," he said, his gaze drifting out over the land, the thriving herds, the sturdy buildings, the creek that sparkled like a silver ribbon in the distance. "I used to believe this ranch was everything. The land, the work. It was all I had, all I thought I needed." He turned his gaze back to her, his gray eyes filled with a love so deep and powerful it took her breath away. "I was wrong. All of this, it was just an empty place. It was just a house waiting for you to make it a home. It was just land, waiting for our family to give it a purpose." Alara's eyes filled with happy tears. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. The baby stirred softly in his sleep between them. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods by the creek, carrying the scent of lavender from her garden and the rich, earthy smell of the land. It was the scent of their life, of their love. It was the scent of home, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have ever dreamed.